All right, welcome to our LionSide Chat for the day. We will get started in just a minute. We're going to let a few folks join. Just as a reminder, check your audio if you wish, and we will get started here in just a minute. All right, let's get started. Welcome to Penn State Berks LionSide Chats. Come on in and welcome to our campus. We are so glad that you could join us this afternoon. My name is Ryan Hassler. I am one of 3 LionSide Chat moderators working alongside Don Pfeiffer-Wrights and Sonia De La Cueto. Before we get started, just wanted to share that you should feel free during our session today to submit questions through the Q&A feature of this webinar. We won't be using the chat feature or the raise hand. So if you have questions, we encourage those, and please use the Q&A feature. Today's chat is part of a 6-part summer series on the Penn State values. So today, the Penn State value we'll be speaking about is responsibility. Once the presentation concludes, we will facilitate a conversation, a discussion with our presenter here about responsibility. So I am very excited and very eager to welcome Dr. Janelle Larson, Associate Professor of Agricultural Economics at Penn State Berks, currently the division chair of our EBC, Engineering, Business, and Computing. Dr. Larson has been on campus at Penn State Berks for 26 years. And interestingly, which is why we were thrilled that she agreed to do this chat, today is the first day that she is no longer our interim dean for academic affairs. So she has spent the last 3 years in a 1-year interim position. So in terms of responsibility, I'm sure she will shed some light on that. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Larson, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this series and to present on responsibility.
All right, well, thank you. I'll get my screen up, get ready to go. There we are.
Perfect.
Well, good afternoon. I'm very excited to be able to be with you today to talk about one of the Penn State values. As Professor Hassler mentioned, there are 6 Penn State values. I've got them all listed on my introductory slide because as I was working on this, I found that they're all sort of interconnected. So obviously today we are going to be talking about responsibility, but I wanted us to be reminded about the other 5. So the 6 values are excellence, respect, responsibility, integrity, community, and discovery. When we're thinking about responsibility, it does tie into the others. It ties into integrity. It ties into our role in a community. So we are going to think about how these all fit together a little bit. Oops, let's see. There we go. So when we're speaking today, I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview about responsibility, what the word means, where it came from, and then to think about how responsibility plays out in our lives in a really practical way. It's really tied to our roles. So what are our responsibilities as someone who's learning, as a student here at Penn State Berks? What are our responsibilities as a professional and a member of the larger society? What are our responsibilities in terms of our relationships to those that we live and work with on a closer basis? And then we'll kind of tie it together and, think about some of the more, challenging or complex issues when we're talking about responsibility. When I think about a word or a concept, I like to dig into it a little bit more. So just to think about the word responsibility, I first have up there in bold the way it's defined by Penn State as a part of our Penn State values. I'll read it for you. I'm sure you could all read, but so responsibility in terms of the Penn State values is we act responsibly and we are accountable for our decisions, our actions, and their consequences. So as I said, when I started thinking about this for this presentation, I like to dig into the etymology of a word a little bit, just to think about, where did it come from? How did its meaning develop? What's the root of that meaning, and why does that matter? So back as early as the 1590s, they found use of a word related to responsibility or responsible in the Latin. And at that time, it was primarily used in the meaning of answerable. And if you think about it, that makes sense even in the English, right? If we think of, to respond means to answer. And so responsibility is that you were answerable to someone about something. And then within another 50 years or so, it had developed the use and the meaning that we really think of now, that's really focused on accountability for somebody's actions. So for, going on 400 years, responsibility has had this meaning of being accountable. So what it fundamentally means is we own our actions. And in some ways that can almost seem like a negative thing, right? You can think of your parents saying, who's responsible for this mess or this broken vase? And it seems punitive or negative. But really, and what I hope we can think about today is how empowering responsibility is. If we don't have responsibility, if we lack responsibility, then we don't have the ability to make change or to make something different or better. So it's really, empowering and builds that sense of agency that we have the ability to make things different. And you can only really grow, and I want to use the word responsibility. You can only have additional responsibilities personally and professionally by accepting that responsibility. So I've thrown in a couple quotes from people that have thought about responsibility longer than I have, starting with Winston Churchill. And as we have here, the price of greatness is responsibility. So when we think about responsibility, it's often tied to the concept of free will and accomplishment or achievement. So we're going to start thinking about how does that tie in to your role as a student. And I don't want to assume that you haven't had these responsibilities before. I know that many of you have been very responsible. But at least by the time you're a college student, these responsibilities are really on you. And these are responsibilities that, say, in high school or when you were younger, would have been shared primarily with your parents, in part with your teachers. So the items that I have noted there might seem really basic, but they're worth mentioning. So as a college first-year student, you are responsible for, simply getting out of bed in the morning and getting to the classroom on time, even if that's, an 8 a.m. or an 8:30 class. And again, that might seem obvious, but that's something that students sometimes have a little struggle with. And again, we want to think about this responsibility being something you can own, right? It's not your roommate's responsibility. If they were up late and making noise, it's still your responsibility to be able to get out in the morning and make it to class. One challenge that a lot of college students have is dealing with time management. Again, when you're in high school, your day is fairly structured. You're in school, say 6 or 7 hours a day. You have defined times to attend lectures. You usually have study halls or a little bit of time during class to work on things. That's all gone when you're in college. You might only be in class for, 15, 18, 20 hours a week. And the rest of that time is not actually free time. The rest of that time is time that you need to organize and schedule for that studying that's no longer happening inside a structured classroom environment. And again, that's fundamentally a responsibility. It's a responsibility to think about how you're using your time and make sure that you're making good use of your time. When we think about responsibilities, again, we're really going to be focusing primarily on, especially as a student, your responsibilities to yourself, but they sometimes overlap with responsibilities to others. You've probably had group projects before. If you haven't, you certainly will have them while you're at Penn State Berks. The goal of group projects in class there's usually a couple goals. One is to learn the content of the course, whatever that content is. But beyond that, the goal of that assignment is to learn how to work with others, how to learn to collaborate, how to divide up a project and bring it together to make it look like a cohesive whole, even though each of you have worked on different parts. And so if you're not responsible for your part in that project, you're going to lose out on both of those types of learning. You're going to lose out on learning the content. You're going to lose out on learning those collaborative skills. Beyond that, you're going to be letting down your teammates. Again, if you've been involved in group projects, you might have had the experience where there's someone who just is a slacker and they have that reputation. And so when you do that to your teammates, your classmates, you're putting them in a very difficult position. Do they do the work without you? Do they wait and hope that you'll come through at the last minute? Do they leave that part out of the project? Do they put your name on the project if they've made it up? So you don't want to let down your classmates. So again, the responsibility for yourself and your peers, they kind of work together in that example. And there are other examples about academic responsibility in your coursework, but I think you kind of get the picture there. Another general area of responsibility that we have as a student is really just the concept that you're going to get out of your college experience what you put into it. And it's really your responsibility to find those opportunities. There are a lot of people who are going to be pointing out opportunities for you. You'll have a first-year seminar. You'll have an academic advisor. You'll have lots of faculty for all your classes. You'll have, if you're living in the residence halls, an RA and staff there to support you. And they'll all be reminding you of these opportunities. But fundamentally, it's up to you to grasp those opportunities. And again, I've listed a couple of them here. While you're a student at Penn State Berks, especially, we have many opportunities to do research with a faculty member. And as you're starting out, that might not sound like something that you would even think of doing, but as you spend some time here and get into your degree program, that will be a way to really get into it in depth and to learn more about the content, whatever you may be studying. It's also a very good way to develop a closer relationship with a faculty member who could then help as a mentor and writing letters of reference. So it's really just a rich and meaningful learning experience. On the co-curricular side, there are a number of clubs on campus, really for almost any interest you might have. And early in the semester, there'll be a club rush. And again, you'll be encouraged to attend that by those resources I mentioned before, first-year seminars, RAs, that sort of thing. But it's up to you to actually go to the club rush, find a couple things you might be interested in, and sign up. Many of our students also work while they're studying. And so if you can find a job on campus, that's a convenient way to combine your different parts of your life, makes it a little bit less complex if you don't have to go off campus to work, and there are opportunities for working on campus. And then finally, if you need support, there are a number of resources on campus that are available. Everyone has an academic advisor. We also have an advising center that helps students who are maybe undecided about what they want to study. We have a learning center, a writing center, all of these resources available for students. And again, many people are more than willing to help point you to those resources, but the responsibility is on you as a student to actually get there and take advantage of these resources. I'm having a hard time getting my slides to move. There we go. So as we're transitioning to looking at responsibility beyond academics or beyond being a student, I want to think about how that ties into leadership. So as this quote from Seth Berkley notes, leadership is about vision and responsibility, not power. So again, there's this idea of responsibility and leadership and accountability going together. So again, now we can think about responsibility in terms of our membership in society as a whole and in our professions. So when we're thinking about responsibility in our work, in our careers, and just more generally, again, these Penn State values all sort of merge together. So in order to be responsible, fundamentally, you have to make ethical decisions, and you have to own these decisions. So very fundamentally, responsibility means that your word means something, that you have integrity in your actions and the decisions you make. When we think about responsibility, that often ties back to use of resources, especially financial resources. So at a bare minimum, that means, don't embezzle, don't pad your expense sheet. That's kind of a low bar when we're thinking about responsibility in terms of ethics and specifically looking at the use of resources, but it really means be a responsible steward of the resources that you have under your control, whatever that might be. Thinking about leadership, as Professor Hassler just mentioned, I'm just stepping down as being associate dean. So when you're in a leadership role, what's really important is to be a good team player and to help develop the leadership potential of others and the professional development broadly of others. So when you're in a leadership role, part of your responsibility is acknowledging the input of everybody on your team, because inevitably there is a team, and to support others and help them in their professional development. When we talk about owning our decisions, that means we own all of our decisions, the ones that turned out well and the ones that turned out not so well. So if we make a mistake, either in something that we've done or something that we haven't done that we realize later that we should have, again, we need to own that. We need to admit that. When we're talking about that, professionally, it's often obvious. People are going to know. So you might as well accept it. And generally speaking, your colleagues, those you work with, will appreciate that you're owning your mistakes, learning from them, and moving on. And again, it's part of being a responsible leader. And then fundamentally, responsibility is about keeping your commitments. I mentioned when we're talking about responsibility as a student, team projects. One reason that we want people to learn about that as students is that that's something you keep doing throughout your professional career. So in my example, a lot of my research is collaborative. We'll have a research team. And when there is a call for proposals out and we're going to start working on a grant proposal, when we're deciding who we want on that team, part of it is driven by, what that proposal calls for. What disciplines do we need to have covered, or what sorts of backgrounds do we need to have covered? But really fundamentally, what's more important is who do we know we can count on? Who is going to be a good team member? So if they say, I'm going to write the methods section of the proposal, it's actually going to get done. Or if they say, I'll help work on the survey questionnaire when we're ready to do the study, you can count on them to do what they say they're going to do. And that is important professionally, because no matter if someone's brilliant, but you can't count on them, they don't take responsibility, they're not going to be invited to collaborate on these sorts of projects. So it's really only through accepting responsibility and following through with our responsibilities that we're going to get more opportunities, that we're going to get more growth. And then I had to include a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. It's a little bit more negative than I would have liked, but it's Eleanor. So she wrote, "Freedom makes a huge requirement of every human being. With freedom comes responsibility. For the person who is unwilling to grow up, the person who does not want to carry his or her own weight, this is a frightening prospect." So again, we have that relationship between responsibility and freedom, and responsibility and growth. Okay, so then finally, if we think about responsibility that we have, beyond being a student or being a professional, but just to the people that we interact with on a regular basis. And so this could be, depending on where you are, at what stage in your life, it could be your birth family, your parents and your siblings. It could be a family you're starting, or a partner or a spouse. It could be, if you're living in the dorms, your roommate. I would include with this just friendships, people that we have personal relationships of all different sorts. I'm assuming you haven't been taking notes, but if by chance you have, or you have a good memory, many of these bullet points are exactly the same ones that I had under professional responsibilities. And they're related to the ones that we have as a student, because really the concepts are the same. They just sort of play out in different ways. So when you think about your responsibilities to others, again, make sure that you keep your commitments, right? We all have the friend who says, sure, I'll be there, but we know that they may or may not actually be there. And you don't want to be one of those friends. So if you're going to make a commitment to be there, then be there, right? And if you're not sure that you can, don't commit. If admitting mistakes is important on your professional side of your life, it's equally, if not more important, on the personal side of your life. Again, it's inevitable that we make mistakes, either of commission or omission, things that we've done that we shouldn't have, or that we didn't do that we should have. And acknowledging that in your personal life is at least as important as it is in your professional life. And again, it's a matter of maturity and being responsible. Be a supportive friend. And sometimes that means, being the cheerleader, giving your friend the confidence to do what you really believe they can do. Sometimes it might be protecting your friend. So if you're out and you feel like your friend is in a dangerous situation, maybe it's time to, grab them by the elbow and quietly pull them aside, or get the keys out of their hands. Sometimes your responsibility as a friend can be a little bit difficult, but it really means, looking out for what's best in your friend and best for your friend. And I think fundamentally, we all want to have relationships that help us grow, right? I'm a mom. I tell my kids this. I tell them, you want to have friends that bring out the best in you, that, you can learn from, that stretch you, that challenge you in a good way. And you want to be that sort of friend to others. You don't want to be the friend who's, leading someone astray and taking them down a path that's, going to encourage them or facilitate their failing a course or getting into trouble. You want to be a friend that makes people better, brings out their best. And then fundamentally, you need to know yourself. You need to know what you're comfortable with, what really matters to you. And you need to know, what your boundaries are. And it's only by knowing yourself that you can really have responsible relationships with others. Because if you're not being true to yourself, you're not going to be able to really be there for other people. Okay. So just to recap a little bit, again, when we're thinking about the Penn State values, we call them the Penn State values, but if you look at them, they're actually not unique to Penn State, right? These are more or less universal values. That can be kind of hard to say, but they're values that we hope you will carry with you beyond Penn State. And they're certainly valued beyond Penn State. And when Professor Hassler first asked me to speak about responsibility, to be honest, he's on there even though his camera's off, I was having a little value envy. I was like, oh, why couldn't I have talked about integrity? Integrity is fundamental. It's the rock of who we are. If we don't have integrity, you don't have anything. We could talk about integrity for a really long time. or discovery. Discovery is fun and exciting. You want to spring out of bed and go, oh, what can we discover today that no one else has known? And, you can really get excited about discovery. But responsibility, that's kind of a downer. That's like, again, your parents saying who's responsible for this. That's kind of what it comes down to me. So I had to sort of work through it and think about, what is the positive side of responsibility? And by the time I prepared this talk, I felt really happy about it. But so it's not just an obligation. It's not just a negative. It really is what's required for agency and empowerment. If we go through life saying, well, I failed that test because my alarm didn't go off and I was tired because my roommate kept me up all night, then when that next test comes around, it's not really on me to make sure that I pass it because it wasn't my fault that I failed the first one. So I don't have that sense of agency. Or if it's your parents' fault or someone else's fault, then you don't really have the ability to turn it around. So it's not always pleasant or easy, but only by really owning that can you make a difference. And only by really owning that can you enjoy the accomplishment that comes out of your successes. So responsibility isn't all a negative thing. So I wanted us to have a little bit of time to think about responsibility in our own lives. These were a couple questions that I think are, very fundamentally thinking about evolving sense of responsibility. How do our responsibilities change over the lifetime? So maybe, when you're a child, your responsibilities are fairly well defined and constrained. As a child, you're responsible for feeding the dog and taking out the trash on Thursday. And then as a young adult, your primary responsibilities, for most people at least, is to yourself. You're responsible for, what we were looking at in terms of being a student. As you get further along in life, you develop responsibilities to others. If you have children, if you have a spouse, if you have a mortgage, the responsibilities grow. And how do we adapt and make sure that we're really prepared and thoughtful about how we deal with that? And then how do we deal with conflicting responsibilities? There's not a quick and easy answer to that. Sometimes our responsibilities to ourselves and to others might be in conflict. Professor Hassler might be intending to ask me about this, but he did mention it with my introduction that I was interim associate dean for a couple of years. And that was a responsibility within the college that I didn't seek for the long term. And so I felt a responsibility to the institution and to my colleagues to step into that role and fill it for longer than I intended, but fill it for a while, fill it as long as needed. But I also knew that with a responsibility to myself, I really enjoyed the research that I'm able to do, and I really want to get back out there and do more of that. So I didn't want to stay in that role forever. So I was able to balance those conflicting responsibilities because it was a finite time. So for a finite time, I put my responsibilities to others ahead of myself. But I know myself well enough to know that, I'm not going to spring out of bed every morning excited to be associate dean, sorry. So I didn't want to do it forever. So I think, sometimes there's a time element. We can balance conflicting responsibilities. Sometimes there are other ways you can balance it out depending on what the specific examples are. But these values are not always cut and dried and not always clear, that's part of life. And that's why, we have a conversation about these values so we can learn to work through them a little bit. Okay, and then as we get to the Q&A, I did find a nice positive quote about responsibility. So it's only when you take responsibility for your life that you discover how powerful you truly are. So that's all I've got.
Great. For all of our participants, please feel free. There's some Q&As coming in right now, but feel free to add a few questions. Dr. Larson, there's a few questions coming in. I'll try to group some of them together, but there's several, I think, first-year students on the call here, and they're talking about maybe the responsibility, the balance of their academic responsibilities as a student. So you mentioned things like joining clubs and looking into research, and then going to, class. I think for a lot of incoming students, they're viewing school as you show up at 7:30 in the morning at a high school, right? And you go to class and things are kind of more structured. So several students are asking about this, how do you balance these different components of academic responsibility as a college student? So what would you, suggest for that?
Sure. Well, I'll go back. I have a brother who's 5 years older than me. And so he's really old now. But when I was entering college, he sat me down and he said, college is very different than high school. And what my brother told me, I won't tell you how long ago this was he said, make your day, whatever works for you, be like a work day. So he said, 8 to 5 is when you do your academics. And so within that time, if you're in class, great, you're in class. But if you're not in class, use that time to read the chapter, review your notes, write out questions that you want to ask the professor. So he said, use the time that you, or if you want to stick with your high school schedule, although that was kind of early for a lot of people, maybe you want to shift it back a little bit. So maybe it doesn't have to be 8 or 9 hours a day, maybe it's 6 or 7 hours a day, but set that block of time as your study time. Or if your schedule is such that, on Tuesday and Thursday, you have a class from 9 to 10, and then you don't have another class until 3. Don't just go and play pool or whatever between 11 and 3. Use that time as study time. And then what that does is that, if you do your studying, whatever, 9 to 3 or 9 to 4, that means you've got your evening to do clubs or to work at McDonald's or to, hang out with your roommate. But I would say, the things that you have to get done, it's your responsibility to build those in first. And as a student, you're here to be a student, and you want to make sure that at the very least that you're passing your classes and getting the most out of that. The co-curriculars are important, but those are, supplemental.
Have you seen the responsibility of a student change over your, time in academia? I mean, I guess I was in school, as a college student 15, 20 years ago. And I didn't have a whole lot of friends who were working part-time jobs. I didn't have a whole lot of friends who were non-traditional. And maybe that was just my experience. But have you seen, as we have more and more students who might not be, might be more non-traditional students, commuters, living at home, working, balancing, life and family. Have you seen responsibilities change over your time for students on our campus?
Yeah, I think I would agree with what you just described. I think we have a good number of our students at Berks do work. And, as I mentioned, it's convenient if you can work on campus, but many people don't and can't. So many people are working. We have a good number of veterans who are, a little bit older and definitely have a different set of experiences behind them. We do have students who, are saving money and living at home. So that does change what we think of as the concepts of, back when I went to school in the 80s, your responsibility was 100% on school. And so students do have conflicting responsibilities. I think, again, what is important is to try to be able to, sort through, okay, for my long-term goals and objectives, what kind of trade-offs might we have to make? So maybe it means working a little bit fewer hours So you make sure that you pass your classes and don't have to take them again, because, you know, if you have to repeat a class, that's not a good use of anybody's time. So you want to do well enough that you're going to keep making academic progress, even when people are juggling more balls than I really had to when I was an undergraduate.
Great. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine some of the students I work with, and, you know, are working 2-3 part-time jobs. I can't imagine. I did a little bit of tutoring on the side when I was in college, but some of the stories and, you know, taking care of families or, you know, parents or children, it just, I'm sometimes very, you know, my jaw drops when I understand and I hear some of the stories of what my students, you know, are responsible for outside of the classroom. So, yeah, I mean, it has changed, I think. But going along that line, if I say this term, responsibility of learning, how might that look different from the high school perspective for our incoming students and at the college level? You know, who's responsible for learning? Who's responsible for this academic knowledge that we're generating on our campus at this level of academia?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I think that's something that can be a difficult transition for a lot of students. In high school, and again, it varies by the high school, and I don't want to say they hold your hand, but they're always very attentive. And the faculty at Penn State Berks are very attentive and very concerned. But, you know, you'll see most of your instructors in class for 3 hours a week. You know, a high school teacher, you would see it, generally speaking, a lot more than that, depending on the subject and how your schedules are organized. And so much of, and, you know, it's rare inside, you know, that inside your class time, you might have a little bit of time to work on homework, but homework is really homework. You're really, you know, when a professor says, you know, you should read chapters 1 to 6, they're going to expect that you've read chapters 1 to 6. and they might go over the highlights in class. They might, you know, give you kind of a bulleted outline, but it's really on you to do the work outside of class. And I think that can be a bit of a shock to a lot of students. Again, there's a lot of support. Our faculty have office hours. They're willing to work with students and help students, but they can only help you so much. If you haven't cracked your textbook, if you haven't made an attempt at the problems, and you show up at your professor's office hours, there's nothing to build on. There's no way to get traction. So you have to grapple with it. You have to put in your effort, and then the faculty member can help you. But you can't just show up and say, teach me a week's worth of classes. You know, even if they wanted to, that's just not possible, because, you know, a week's worth of classes is like 9 or 10 hours work. So you really have to put in your part so that the faculty member can do their part effectively.
Yeah, I usually, you know, I was a high school teacher for several years. You know, before being here at Penn State, I usually say, you know, I was a teacher and now I'm more of like a facilitator of knowledge, right? I like to guide my students, but the responsibility I don't necessarily view as what happens in the classroom as, you know, my responsibility. It's a shared responsibility. I kind of view my students. I try to get them to think differently about, you know, the environment that they're in. If we can shift just a little bit, maybe a little bit more personal. Do you remember what your first lesson maybe was that you learned in terms of responsibility as a student? Do you remember, you know, ever, you know, thinking about, you know, maybe where these students were, you know, just, or maybe responsibility as a child? Because I think at the beginning you talked about these different responsibilities throughout life. So do you remember like when you first maybe thought about this, or what your first responsibility maybe was that you held?
Sure. I mean, it's not academic at all, but
Sure, that's
fine.
fine.
I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and we raised cattle, and I had to feed the cattle twice a day. And, you know, it didn't matter if I had a test or if there was a blizzard. I mean, this is Kansas, like freezing, gale force winds, snow, you know, they had to eat. And then as I got older, if I had a dance, if I had a test, I think my parents let us off for prom, but that was it. Homecoming, we still had to feed the cattle. And so I think that was a really good lesson in responsibility. And when it's something that's, biological like that, you can't just say, well, maybe if I don't feed them today, no one will notice because they'll be at the fence bawling, and you can't not feed the cattle. So I think that's sort of a silly microcosm, but that was an example of, and I'm sure that many of our students had and have responsibilities in their household that were significant and serious, beyond just taking out the trash.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a very good foundation for, learning my responsibility to my family, to animals that would be uncomfortable if I didn't feed them. And then, just more broadly from that.
Yeah, great. And I can only imagine that helped to shape your academic career too, in terms of, the agriculture, economics, and yeah.
Yeah.
You touched a little bit on this. So maybe I'll take the question just a little bit different, but this goes to the idea that you've spent 3 years in the 1-year interim position. Can you talk about what your view of responsibility is when you maybe have pressure about that responsibility? So, I was in several meetings with you over the last couple of years, and people would joke, "Oh, Janelle's going to be in this position forever," or "Oh, don't you just?" So, can you talk about, that responsibility kind of goes back to that conflicting part? But when you said you had this timeline, how did you deal with the responsibility or the pressure from outsiders, thinking of you and maybe trying to push that timeline or something with that regards? How did you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that goes back to, in one of the slides, I said you have to know yourself. In order to be responsible to others, you have to be able to be responsible to who you are. And so, when I started out as the interim associate dean, again, I hadn't sought it, but I thought, well, maybe this is something that I would want to do. Maybe there's potential. And, it wasn't painful. It wasn't awful, but I didn't get jazzed about it, and it didn't excite me. And life's too short. And I realized that, if people watching this are 18 or 20, it might not seem that way. But life's too short to do something that doesn't excite you, especially when you've got an option, right? Sometimes we have to do things short term, just to pay the bills and just to get through. That's another responsibility. But I guess I didn't mention this, when my kids were, I really enjoy my international work. And when my kids were young, again, it was a kind of these trading off responsibilities. I had a responsibility to not dash off to Africa when I got preschoolers. Bummer. So I did domestic research for a good number of years while my kids were little. Now my kids are old enough to be self-sufficient, and they're perfectly happy when I leave and hopefully happy when I come back. And so I can take on that international work now. So again, it's a matter of balancing those responsibilities to, an institution or to family, and responsibilities to knowing, really what motivates you and what really excites you. And the idea of a vocation, again, going back to etymology, that the VOC there is like a calling, right? Vocal and voice. So knowing what your calling is, knowing what your vocation is a part of growing up, and again, balancing those responsibilities when you can.
Well, again, as a member of the Penn State Berks community, we thank you for your service over the last 3 years and for the responsibility that you took on to help lead us through the rather tough times over, even the last 18 years. So, I feel like we had a great leader and somebody that really helped the campus in terms of the academic responsibilities. So just thank you as you transition back into just that division head role. Not that that's not anything, significant, but we do really appreciate the responsibility that you took on for us. We have two more questions here from audience members. We'll start with this one. This was from, I believe, an incoming student. What tips can you give us to help us hold ourselves accountable for being responsible?
That's a good question. I think different people have different techniques. I would say being organized and, setting out, the sort of little mini goals for your day or mini goals for your week, and making sure that you stay on top of those goals and objectives in a timely way. One thing that can be challenging about college, and this kind of gets back to what you were mentioning earlier about the difference between high school and college, is, we don't have, you might go several weeks before you have any sort of an assessment. You might go several weeks before the first quiz or exam. And that doesn't mean you should wait several weeks before you open your book. So I think it's important to break things down into smaller pieces and, however you want to reward yourself for doing that. If you make lists and say, today I'm going to focus on chemistry and tomorrow I'm going to focus on history, or I'm going to spend, an hour on each day, or however you want to do it. And then hold yourself accountable to that. I think it's also important to put in little rewards, put in, even if it's something like, okay, if I study for 2 hours, then I'll go play a game of pool. Or if I study for an hour, then I'll go get an ice cream with my roommate, or, whatever it is. And don't beat yourself up if you don't meet your goals and objectives. If that first test isn't what you'd hoped for, don't despair, but take that and learn from it. Maybe talk to the professor, go to the learning center, try to figure out why it didn't turn out the way you'd hoped. So I think, part of the responsibility is giving yourself schedule, giving yourself, little mini rewards along the way, and then also not beating yourself up if things don't work out the way you'd hoped.
And maybe you touched upon this last question here that I see with that, that question was more about the accountability part, although that was in the definition of, our Penn State value of responsibility. But the last question here is, what can I do as, an incoming student to start accepting more of responsibility? So more of like, taking on more roles in terms of responsibility.
I mean, on the academic side, it's kind of inevitable. I mean, it's on you. You can't get away from that. On the co-curricular side, there'll be a lot of opportunities. In my role as associate dean, and even as a professor or a division head, I've been able to work with student leaders on campus. And so as your first semester might be a little bit harder to have a leadership role, but as you're moving through your time at Penn State, you can, take on a leadership role in a club. You definitely will have opportunities. Again, even at the smaller level, there's a lot of ways you can do it. You can form a study group for a class. If you're in a class and a lot of people are like, I just don't get this. If you form a study group, you can learn from each other and you can take the initiative. You can take the responsibility to form that group. You could be a peer mentor. Again, it doesn't necessarily happen your first semester, but you can take a leadership role within your academics. If there's a team project, or even if there's not a team project, just helping others through the academics. One thing that's kind of interesting about college is that while there are people with, we've got people coming with different backgrounds and different experiences, when you look around your classroom, you've got 20, 30, 40 people that are all in the same boat as you, and chances are, if you have a question, there are others that have similar questions, and working together can be a really good way to help with learning and help, develop some of these leadership and responsibility qualities.
I think that's a great, parting words in terms of for incoming students. So I just want to thank you again, like I said, for the responsibility that you've taken on over the last 3 years at Penn State Berks, and for agreeing to shed some light on this value. I was unaware that you were a little bit disappointed in not picking not being able to pick one of the other ones. But like I said, we pegged you right from the beginning because of the support that you've given the campus and the responsibility you took on. So we appreciate it. I'm glad that you ended up enjoying preparing for the talk once you dug in. But I really do think, like you said, I don't think these values are picked independently of each other when we think about the Penn State values. So I really appreciate that you mentioned the idea of how interconnected they are, because you're right. As you were speaking, I kept coming back to, oh well, that's integrity, or that's leadership, or that's discovery, right?
Yeah.
So I do appreciate that. Thank you so much again for participating and for being part of our the third part in our 6-part series on the Penn State values for this summer. Special thank you to everybody who attended today's LionSide Chat. There will be a quick survey when we log out of the webinar here. If you can take a few minutes to give us some feedback, we really would appreciate that. You are encouraged to reach out to us via email, as you see on the screen, and remind you to keep checking our website as we continue to add new chats, and we're planning our LionSide Chats for the upcoming fall semester. Our next part of this series will be next Friday, the 23rd, and that will be about respect at Penn State. So please join us then. That'll be at 12 noon next Friday. And with that, be sure to come back and meet with our faculty, staff, and students to learn more about our exciting majors, experiences, the values here at Penn State Berks. Stay safe, Berks and beyond, and we are signing off until next time. This has been the Penn State Berks LionSide Chats, and thank you again, Dr. Larson.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yep. Take care. Thanks.
Bye.